Hello everyone and welcome to Hazian Education World channel. The previous video was an introduction about iterators in Python, in which we've seen the difference between iterables and iterators, and how to use iterators to get the items of an iterable one at a time. For those who didn't watch the video, I will post a link in the description below. Today we will create an iterator not from an iterable object using the iter method as we've seen previously, but we will create our own iterator using a class. So the main idea is to create a class of objects, and these objects will behave exactly like the iterators we obtained by using the iter method of the iterable objects. To do so, our object must have an iter method, since, as we've seen in the previous video, iterators are also iterable objects, so they have the iter method. They must also have a next method, because iterators have a special next method which will give us the items one at a time. And finally, our object must raise a stop iteration error whenever the items are exhausted when we call the next method manually. So in this example, I want to create an iterator which will give me one IP address at a time. This makes me think a little bit of a DHCP server in IP networks, but this is not an implementation of a real DHCP, which is much more complex than what we are going to do now. But it's just a very basic example, which I hope will help to understand more the usage of iterators, and maybe will inspire some of you to think of other practical examples when iterators could be used. So let's get started. So first I will create a class, and I will call it IP address. Then I will create the init method. Sorry, there's a space here. The init method, and in the init method I will create a class attribute called host, and this host I will initiate it at the value of 0. So this host should represent the host part of an IP address. And for those who are not familiar with IP addresses, the IP address is composed of two parts, the network part and the host part. So the host part, I will create it as an attribute of our object, and this part will change and will be incremented from 0 to some value which we will set for our subnet. And then we will add the iter method, and in the iter method will return self, because we know that the iterator object is also an iterable, so it must have the iter method which will return the iterator from our iterable. And then we will create the next method. So as we've said previously, our class object must have these two methods, the iter method and the next method, in order to behave as an iterator object. So in this part, I will increment the host by 1. Okay, and I will create one variable called IP, and this will be the value which I want to have as a result. So it will be the IP address in this form 192.168.1. So this is the first part of our IP address. This is the network part, which will not change, plus and here I will use the self host, which will represent the host. For example, if I have a network, I will have it inside this network, many hosts, many computers, for example, and the computers will use unique IP addresses. The DHCP server will give IP addresses, and all these IP addresses belonging to the same subnet, and it will give one at a time. Whenever a host requests an IP address, the DHCP server will give one IP address to this host, and then it will give another IP address to another host dynamically. So after this, this should return the IP. Okay, so now we have added the iter method and the next method. Remaining the stop iteration error, we will add it in after a few seconds. We'll just run our code in this way and test. Okay, so this will not return anything. I will create an object. I will call it my IP using this class we've created just now, IP address. So let's print the next function using our object as a variable, as an argument. Okay, so next my IP, let's run our code. Okay, there is an error here, self not defined. Okay, where is the error? Okay, there's a mistake here. I didn't notice it when I was typing. Sorry for this. Let's try. Okay, and here we have the value of the next function applied to our object. So this represents the first item in our iterator. So my IP is an iterator. To test our iterator, we need to execute one more time the next function to see if it will give us the next item which we want. So in this case, it is not incremented. So let's see why. Okay, I see why. See, there is no equal sign here. It should be an equal sign. This is the reason why we still have 0 here. This is not what we want. Okay, we want, for example, the first time the DHCP server will give this address, and the second time it will give the next address, which will be 1 here, and so on. So let's run again the code, and you see here, this is what we want. Okay, so and we don't have 0 here. It will start from 1. because we increment the host part before returning the IP. So the first returned IP is incremented, so it will be 1, not 0, because the 0 in the networking is usually reserved for the network. So for the host they start from 1. So if you want more IP addresses, we need to call the next function more times. For example, here 5 times. Okay, let's run it. We have 5 different IP addresses, one at a time. Okay, so what about the stop iteration error? To have the stop iteration error, we need to add some condition here. Let's fix the number of hosts we want to 10, for example. So if self host equals to 10, so we will have a maximum of 10 hosts and 10 IP addresses in our network using our DHCP server. So if this condition is verified, stop iteration, okay, will be raised. Stop iteration error will be raised. So in order to test this, we need to call this next function, I think 5 more times. We've already called it 5 times, so 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, we have 10 times. Let's run it again. So you see here we have 10 IP addresses, and if we try to call it one more time, so I will copy this next function and paste it here. So here we should have 11, 6, 9, 11. Okay, so we have 11 times, and if we execute our code, what will happen? It will check when we arrive to when we call the next function the last time. It will check and it will find that the self host is equal to 10, and it should raise the stop iteration, and it will not increment anymore the host. So let's run the code, and you see here we have the stop iteration error. It cannot give more than 10 IP addresses. So in this case, the items are exhausted, and we can define how many hosts we can have in our network. That is the end of this video. I hope that you've enjoyed it. If it's the case, please like the video and subscribe to my channel if you're not yet subscribed, and hit the bell icon to receive notifications about the new videos in Hazian Education World channel. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next videos. Till then, take care.